When Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump, unexpectedly decided to give up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, the passengers on the flight were surprised. The gesture seemed to be just a simple act of kindness, something that many people noticed with admiration. But what no one could have imagined was that this act would trigger a sequence of events revealing an impressive secret, something that connected Barron to an unknown and deeply moving family history. As the airplane crossed the skies, what seemed to be just an ordinary flight turned into a moment that left everyone on board speechless. The cabin lights flickered briefly, casting dancing shadows on the passengers' faces as they adjusted in their seats. It was a cold and busy morning at Ronald Reagan National Airport in Washington. Flight 247 to Newark was full, packed with eager travelers carrying everything from worn-out suitcases to state-of-the-art tablets. The typical pre-takeoff buzz filled the air with a slight chaos, interrupted only by the occasional sound of suitcase wheels rolling down the aisles. Among the first-class passengers, seated near the window, was a young man whose presence seemed both discreet and remarkable. Tall already over 180 meters, Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump, remained silent. He flipped through the pages of a thick hardcover book, trying to blend into the crowd, although it was impossible to ignore the weight of his surname printed on the boarding pass. Unlike the more visible members of his family, Barron had always avoided the spotlight, but in that confined space his identity was impossible to hide. At the other end of the aircraft, a war veteran, already in his 80s, walked slowly toward the economy section. His steps were firm but marked by age. His carefully combed silver hair gleamed under the cabin's soft lighting. Wearing a military jacket adorned with medals and emblems faded by time, he carried a worn leather bag and a posture that exuded dignity. As he moved down the aisle, curious glances followed him, and discreet whispers filled the environment. Some passengers speculated about his decades of service, while others simply admired the serenity emanating from the man. The veteran finally reached his seat at the back of the plane, squeezed between a businessman frantically typing on his laptop and a restless child kicking the seat in front of him. He tried to settle in, but it was evident that the situation made him uncomfortable. On the other side of the aircraft, Barron noticed the veteran as he passed by. His eyes followed the scene as the veteran adjusted his scarf around his neck, frowning upon noticing the elderly man's difficulty. When the cabin door was closed, the flight attendants began the final check before takeoff. It was at that moment that a passenger next to the veteran started complaining loudly, demanding to be reassigned. The growing commotion drew even more attention, with the veteran apologizing, visibly uncomfortable. Barron did not hesitate. Without raising his voice, he pressed the call button above his seat and, when attended to, murmured something that no one around could hear. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to the back of the aircraft addressing the veteran. "A first-class passenger would like to switch seats with you," she announced with a smile, still surprised by the offer. The passengers around froze for a moment, astonished by the proposal. Barron was already standing, adjusting his carry-on luggage. "It's the least I can do," he said calmly, while a woman next to him tried to protest. "You don't need to leave your seat, young man," she insisted, but Barron just smiled. "Some people deserve more than I do," he replied. As he walked down the narrow aisle toward the economy class, passengers began to murmur, many discreetly taking out their phones to record the scene. With each step, he seemed indifferent to the growing attention. Reaching the veteran, Barron slightly bent down and, with a sincere expression, said, "Please accept it. You deserve to be more comfortable." The veteran hesitated for a moment, emotion evident in his eyes. "That's very kind of you, young man, thank you very much," he said, firmly shaking the boy's hand. The simple yet deeply meaningful gesture resonated throughout the cabin. The scene changed the mood of the flight. Passengers began to talk among themselves, sharing admiration for what they had just witnessed. A mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage daughter, whispering with a smile, "That boy just showed us what true respect means." "Did you see what he just did?" whispered a woman in first class, leaning toward the businessman beside her. The man looked up, adjusting his glasses and casting a curious glance at Barron Trump, who was now settling into the economy section. "I've never seen anything like that on a flight, especially from someone like him," he murmured, with a mix of disbelief and respect. Barron, now in the tight seat of the economy class, adjusted his posture, trying to accommodate his height in the limited space. He seemed oblivious to the murmurs around him, his attention fixed on the book he was holding. A flight attendant passed discreetly by him, leaning in to ask if he needed anything. He shook his head silently, a slight smile indicating he was fine. Meanwhile, in first class, the veteran now occupied the luxurious seat that Barron had given up. The difference in comfort was evident: the soft padding, the extra legroom, the adjustable armrests. He placed his hands on the backrest, but they trembled slightly, as if the weight of the gesture was still being processed. A flight attendant approached him with a warm blanket and a complimentary drink. "This is for you." "The young man asked us to ensure your comfort," she said with a warm smile. The veteran looked up, surprised, and nodded in gratitude. "It's been years," he began, his voice low, as if speaking to himself. "It's been many years since someone treated me with such respect." He turned his head toward the economy class, locating Barron with his gaze. The young man remained absorbed in his book, completely unaware of the impact his gesture had caused. The veteran allowed himself a small smile before turning his attention back to the window. The plane began to gain speed on the runway, and the initial tension of boarding seemed to give way to a lighter and, in a way, reverent feeling. When the flight reached cruising altitude and the gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin, the atmosphere, however, remained charged with expectation. Barron's gesture had planted a seed of curiosity and admiration among the passengers. Although the flight attendants passed out drinks and snacks, many passengers were more attentive to the unfolding situation. The veteran, initially silent, seemed to absorb every detail of the moment. He took a sip of water, adjusted the blanket over his knees, and finally, as if the weight of an unfinished story compelled him to speak, turned to the woman beside him. "I need to share something," he said, his voice strong enough to be heard by nearby passengers. The woman, who appeared to be in her 50s, looked at him surprised but with an encouraging smile. "Of course, I'm listening." The veteran lightly touched the pin on his lapel, a purple heart, while taking a deep breath, as if preparing to open a door long closed. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life." The woman leaned in closer, visibly intrigued. "What do you mean?" she asked, curiosity evident in her expression. The veteran leaned back, his voice now firm and laden with emotion as he began his story. "It was many years ago, during the Vietnam War. I was severely wounded in combat, with 2 gunshots to my leg. When I finally managed to return to the United States, I was lost. Directionless, unsupported, hopeless. I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life, but it was hard. I had no roof over my head, barely enough money to eat." He paused, observing the woman's reaction, who seemed captivated by every word. Some nearby passengers, noticing the intensity of the conversation, also began to listen. Then, one day, outside a small diner, a man approached me. He noticed my condition and decided not only to help me but to listen to me. He gave me money, it's true, but what he really offered me was dignity. That man was Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father. The woman was stunned, blinking as if she needed to process the information. "Donald Trump's father," she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. The veteran nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if reliving that moment. "He helped me find a place to live, got me a job, and never asked for anything in return. All he said was, 'You served this country, and it's the least we can do for you.'" Those words stayed with me my entire life. As the veteran spoke, his voice began to gain strength, and more passengers in first class turned their faces toward him. The buzz of the story began to spread like wildfire, jumping from row to row. I always wanted to thank his family, but I never had the opportunity. I thought that moment had passed forever, and now today the grandson of that man gave me this seat. He offered me a gesture I will never forget. In the economy section, Barron remained oblivious to the impact of his action. He calmly read, ignoring the occasional glances thrown his way. But in first class the environment had transformed. The veteran's revelation had awakened something deeper in the passengers. "Do you think I should tell him what you just shared?" the woman asked the veteran, her voice laden with delicacy. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes fixed on the glass of water in front of him, before slowly shaking his head. "No, not yet. Leave the boy alone. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. At least not now." The veteran's words hung in the air like an echo, but the impact was already made. The surrounding passengers, who tried to listen without seeming intrusive, exchanged looks full of admiration and curiosity. A simple act of kindness had transformed into something much bigger, laden with a meaning that seemed to have united the entire cabin. And while contemplative silence reigned for a few moments, something even more unexpected began to happen. A man seated across from the veteran, appearing to be in his 40s, was the first to break the silence. He turned around, leaning slightly back. "Sorry to interrupt, but your story, it really touched me. My grandfather also served in Vietnam. He used to talk about how much it meant when people cared enough to help. What Fred Trump did for you reminds me of the stories he used to tell." The veteran gave a slight smile, adjusting the blanket over his legs. It was a rare gesture, very rare. Small acts of kindness can change everything. Back then, I thought my life was over, but his generosity gave me a second chance. On the other side of the aisle, a young mother, gently rocking a sleeping child in her arms, joined the conversation with a kind smile. My father used to say something very similar. He wasn't a veteran, but he used to say that when someone lifts you up even just a little, you should pass it forward. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today proves that kindness still matters. The veteran listened attentively, his eyes softening as the faces around him began to share stories and reflections. "It's true," he said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "It's not about grand gestures. Sometimes just being acknowledged, knowing that someone cares, can make all the difference. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and what his grandson did again today." The stories continued to emerge. The passengers, initially strangers, now seemed part of something bigger. A flight attendant who had been observing the conversation while organizing trays of drinks finally approached, visibly touched. She sat improvisedly on the arm of an empty chair near the veteran. "I wasn't going to say anything, but my brother served in Iraq. He was never much for talking about it, but once he told me that small gestures of gratitude were what really mattered. Some people would stop to thank him, and he said that was what kept him going when everything seemed to fall apart." The veteran nodded, understanding evident on his face. "Your brother is right. In the worst circumstances, those moments help you keep going." Meanwhile, in economy class, Barron began to notice the admiring glances some passengers were casting his way. He briefly looked up from his book, catching the smile of a woman in a row ahead. He returned it with a polite nod, still not fully understanding the reason for the attention. Back in first class, the veteran turned to the flight attendant, who was still watching him with curiosity. "The gratitude I received from Fred Trump wasn't just for me," he began, adjusting his tone as if explaining something deeply personal. "When someone helps you, you carry it with you. It grows. Since that day, I've done everything I could to honor his gesture by helping others. Today, Barron reminded me of that. It's funny how life brings us back to our roots." The veteran's words seemed to echo throughout the cabin. Some passengers, visibly moved, began to exchange whispers and knowing glances. A sense of unity permeated the space, as if everyone was part of a larger experience. The plane encountered a patch of light turbulence, shaking cups and trays, but no one seemed to care. The atmosphere was almost reverent. Every shared story, every gesture of understanding seemed to weave an invisible connection among all on board. When the pilot announced the approach for landing in Newark, conversations gradually subsided, but the impact of the story lingered in the air. The veteran sat in silence, crossing his hands on his lap as he looked out the window. He seemed lost in thought, a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. In the economy class, Barron reopened his book, adjusting in the tight space as the plane began its descent. But his tranquility would be interrupted by something unexpected. A flight attendant, who had previously heard the veteran's story, walked toward the economy section. She stopped beside Barron's seat and knelt slightly to be at eye level with him. The flight attendant leaned slightly to be at Barron's eye level. Her face lit up with a kind smile, but her words carried an unexpected weight. I wanted you to know something extraordinary about the gentleman you gave up your seat for. He shared a story about his family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from the book, closing it slowly as his curiosity was piqued. For a moment he observed the flight attendant's expression, realizing she was carefully choosing her words. "Yes, of course," he replied, his voice calm but with a note of intrigue. She took a deep breath before continuing. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped this man in a very difficult moment. He took him in when he was at his lowest, offering him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today, by giving up your seat, you brought those memories back to him." Barron remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing the words. His face did not reveal much emotion, but his eyes reflected something deeper, as if he was processing the unexpected connection between the past and the present. Finally, he said simply, "That's something to think about." The flight attendant smiled, leaning slightly forward. "I just thought you should know." As the plane touched down on the runway and began to slow, passengers prepared to disembark. The veteran, who seemed deeply immersed in his thoughts, stood up before most, grabbing his old leather bag. But instead of heading straight for the exit, he did something unexpected. He walked toward the economy section, his eyes scanning the rows until they found Barron, who was now standing, pulling his carry-on luggage. Surprised, Barron looked at him, but before he could say anything, the veteran extended his hand firmly. "Young man, I wanted to thank you personally. What you did today." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Closed a cycle in my life. Your family has a history of kindness, and today you continued it. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook the veteran's hand, his voice low but firm. "It was nothing special, sir." Silence filled the cabin as passengers watched the exchange with almost reverent attention. Some had tears in their eyes, others wore discreet smiles, as if witnessing something greater than themselves. The connection between Barron and the veteran, despite the generational gap, was a living testament to the power of empathy and gratitude. As passengers began to disembark, many stopped to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering warm handshakes and sincere words of gratitude for his service to the country. The atmosphere on the plane was something no one had experienced before, a mix of reflection and unity that transcended the routine of an ordinary flight. At the gate, the veteran made one last pause. He turned, removing his military hat and looking directly at Barron. "You have a good heart, son. Never let that go." Barron nodded, his reserved demeanor softening slightly. The veteran's words seemed to echo within him, leaving a silent but deep mark. As he finally walked away, heading toward the baggage carousel, he took his phone out of his pocket. He paused for a moment as if contemplating his next actions, and then typed a brief message. After a moment of hesitation, he pressed the send button. The message read, "Grandpa would be proud of today." Barron and the veteran's story was much more than a tale of kindness. It was a reminder of the power of small actions, how they can echo beyond the moment and create unexpected connections between people and generations. This journey showed that kindness, gratitude, and empathy are values that transcend time and space, creating invisible bonds that leave lasting marks. If this story inspired you, share it with someone. Let's continue the conversation and remind the world that kindness still matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us what it means to be human.